All right. So, unfortunately, one of our speakers this afternoon, Che Gossett, is not able to join us, and that's fine. Things happen, life happens. Luckily for us, we have an amazing speaker this afternoon, and the way that we'll do this is I'll introduce Joss. Joss will take as much time as he likes and share his work with us. And then I'll do a very short response to Joss's paper and ask a question, and then we'll take a round of questions on Joss's work, and at that point, we'll move to a discussion of the broader themes of the conference as a whole. So, in a way, this frees up some time for the group, and I am sure that not everyone has been able to get involved in the conversation so far. It allows for people who have heard a range of presentations over the last 24 hours to share their thoughts and bring some conclusions to the table. So that's how we'll do things. So let me start by telling you a little bit about Joss Greene. Joss Greene is a fifth-year PhD candidate in sociology here at Columbia University. He studies race, gender, and punishment, and his work on racialized gender regulation in reentry organizations has been published in the journal Social Problems. His dissertation examines prison gender regimes in California from the 1940s to the present, and he began doing prisoner solidarity work in 2012 as a volunteer with Justice Now and the Transgender Gender Variant Intersex Justice Project in the Bay Area. Most recently, he served as a core collective member of the Sylvia Rivera Law Project and is currently a member of the Organizing and Solidarity Committee of the California-based Transgender Advocacy Group. Now, following on from the last panel, I think what we'll see here is that transgender studies moving forward among a younger generation of scholars is a completely different kind of entity than what it's been in the past. And I think Joss Greene's work exemplifies some of the best of it. So welcome, Joss.
Maybe move it a little closer to you, Joss.
How is this? Just speak up. You'll be fine. How is this? I don't know.
Is it red? You see a light? How is this?
Okay, I'll project more. All right. Thank you so much, Kendall, Catherine, Megan, Aya, David, and thank you, Jack, for moderating. Thank you all for being here on a Friday afternoon, and to everyone that has shared either through formal presentations, through questions, or through your time and presence here. It really is an honor to get to conclude such a powerful convening. I'm going to share a little bit from my dissertation research and then look forward to our conversation. The women knew that the odds weren't in their favor. Even if the previous year's Supreme Court decision in Estelle v. Gamble had ruled that prisoners had a constitutional right to medical care, they were transgender, and this was the 1970s. As far as they knew, no transgender prisoner had ever received trans-affirming health care while incarcerated. Nevertheless, in 1977, 3 transgender women at California Medical Facility launched a campaign for hormones and bras. Rachel, Carla, and Marie ultimately won this fight and prompted the California Department of Corrections to add language of transsexuality to their formal policies for the first time in 1978. Understanding that formal legal regulation of trans prisoners has existed for the past 40 years shatters the conventional wisdom that trans prison policy is a new phenomenon. If our current situation is less of a sea change and more of a continuation, we should ask what's unique about this moment, but also examine how institutional definition and management of gender boundaries is central to the overall project of imprisonment. My dissertation examines prison gender classification and the ways prisoners at the gender margins have understood, negotiated, and contested gender classification individually and collectively. I collected research in government and social movement archives, conducted 13 months of ethnography in trans prisoner advocacy organizations in California, and conducted 55 oral history interviews with formerly incarcerated transgender people, prisoner advocates, and a few former prison staff. should say I'm not going to talk in detail about methods during this part, just because it's so moving to me. I could talk probably for my full time, but I am happy to answer any questions about that in the Q&A. So how does this research connect to today's topic of reframing transgender violence? Much of the research on violence experienced by trans prisoners, and there's actually a lot of it in sociology, focuses on interpersonal violence. We then have important and necessary critiques of the prison system as fundamentally violent, and yet this structural critique of its fundamental violence does not in and of itself tell us how that violence operates institutionally, and therefore cannot tell us which reforms to pursue en route to dismantling the system, and which reforms may repurpose confinement and captivity in new ways. The dominant way for thinking about the administrative violence of prisons for trans people is the idea that prisons are sex-segregated total institutions in which any perceived or actual deviance from gender norms is punished. And yet, in my interviews and archival research, a more complicated picture of gender regulation in prison emerged. In California, the Department of Corrections has defined and controlled the gender margins in a variety of ways, from segregation to psychological treatment, from reifying legal gender boundaries to blurring those boundaries. Understanding this history tells us that prison gender classification is symbolically and administratively central to the prison and its reproduction as an institution of labor market control and racial domination. However, the terms on which classification occurs are more flexible than we commonly imagine. It's worth understanding previous incarnations of gender classification so we don't mistake a shift in gendered control for a weakening of the carceral system. And so we can learn about the unintended consequences of advocacy that eliminates one gender regime only to see it replaced by another. In this project, I think intersectionally in three ways about gender categories within penal institutions. First, I take an ideological approach, looking at the ways that legal prison gender categories are shaped by evolving conceptions of racialized gender. Second, I take a structural approach, looking at the ways that gender classification maintains a carceral system that is fundamentally about class control and racial domination. Third, I take an experiential approach, looking at the ways that trans prisoners understand and enact their racial and gender identities in negotiation with formal prison rules, as well as through interactions and other forms of identity work. So, let's hear about the data. In 2013, California modified their Department Operations Manual to create a new category, Transgendered Inmates. It's true then to say that the transgender prisoner is a new legal category. And yet, the prison practice of monitoring, regulating, and controlling the gender margins is not new. In California, we can trace this back to the early days of the California Department of Corrections in the 1940s. In 1941, Clinton Duffy, new warden of San Quentin State Prison, created, quote, Queens Row, and began to segregate, quote, prison queens. In Duffy's eyes, same-sex sexuality was explosive and dangerous. This combustible sexuality originated with the prison queen, who awoke perverted desire in normal men and spread a contagion of violence. Through the segregated Queens Row, Clinton sought to keep queens from obtaining men to fight over and from kindling desire in men who would fight over them. He reflected on this reform with pride in his memoir, and I quote, "In the old days, most of the fights which drew shots from the gun towers had arisen over what are known in prison parlance as queens. We cleaned out the old Spanish cell block, put steel control fences around it, and then rounded up all the known aggressive homosexuals. And 90% of our prison sex problems, fights, knifings, thefts, even murder, have been eliminated." Femininity, then, was thought to pose a security problem. Feminine prisoners instigated same-sex sexuality, and same-sex sexual relationships led to violence. The way to prevent the behavior and the resultant cycle of violence was to isolate the instigator, imagined to be feminine homosexuals. Duffy's concern and this policy reflected the ideas and practices of middle-class white male eugenicists of that period, in which urbanization, working-class movements, women's suffrage, mass immigration, and imperial anxiety contributed to fears about dangerously feminized white middle-class manhood. American eugenicists had shifted away from explicitly racialized language of population control after World War II in order to differentiate their program from Nazism. So while continuing programs of sterilization, eugenic rhetoric shifted to emphasize the threat posed by homosexuality, which was linked to criminal behavior and presented as a societal threat to healthy families and the nation. When the 1944 Prison Reorganization Act created the California Department of Corrections, Duffy was appointed to the Oversight Committee, and this policy of segregating effeminate homosexuals became CDC official policy. The 1951 classification manual stated that a prisoner should be sent to San Quentin if he was, quote, an effeminate homosexual who requires institutional segregation. The CDC's 1945 through 1949 report on sex offenders shows that more white men were convicted of sex offenses, but when the data is disaggregated, more men of color, particularly those classified as Mexican, were convicted of rape, and more white men were convicted of sodomy and sex perversion. This suggests that legal prison gender classification in the CDC's early years was a racial project in two ways. First, men of color were framed as dangerous sexual predators. Second, white men were identified, or likelier to be identified, as queens or effeminate homosexuals, threats to prison security and the social order through contagious white male weakness. First segregated at San Quentin, then Soledad, administrators' concern in determining where to send predominantly white effeminate homosexuals was that the facility could keep them away from other white men who they might corrupt. In 1955, the CDC built a medical prison, California Medical Facility in Vacaville. One reason for constructing this medical facility was, quote, research to help solve the problem of sex deviants. Homosexuality was growing to be understood as a distinctive psychological problem, and femininity an external symptom of this internal deviance. Prisons were seen as laboratories to understand homosexuality and develop ways to control it. Prisoners classified as B category effeminate homosexuals were immediately sent to California Medical Facility. As Regina Kunzel has shown, prisons not only targeted and responded to gender and sexual variance, but played a primary role in producing our knowledge about it. By 1976, the CDC's classification manual characterized Category B prisoners based on sexual behavior, quote, inmates with a recorded history of passive homosexual involvement and, quote, continued and recurrent homosexual behavior, as well as gender expression, quote, inmates who are effeminate and whose current conduct is of a flamboyant and uncontrollable nature. By sending those labeled as effeminate homosexuals to a medical facility for research purposes, the prison system exploited a captive population to reify the homosexual as a category and then used this category to justify ongoing criminalization. Despite the growing overrepresentation of men of color in the California prison system during this period, gender variance continued to be racialized as white. But while white male effeminacy had threatened white manhood in the previous era, this period marked the emergence of the racialized narrative of prison rape and white manhood as threatened by predatory black male rapists. Civil rights and black power organizing in this period posed a major challenge to the existing racial order. Concurrently, feminists had proposed new ways of thinking about sexual violence as being centrally about power and demanded greater attention for rape survivors. In the 1960s and 1970s, social scientists, journalists, and prison administrators developed a narrative that prison rape was about black aggression and white victimization. Specifically, that punking whites was driven by black racial resentment, that the rape of white men was compensatory for black men without acceptable ways of accomplishing masculinity, or that this violence arose from a black criminal subculture of violence. As the rehabilitative era shifted towards hyperpunitiveness and mass incarceration in the 1980s, rigid gender classification on the grounds of medical and psychiatric expertise were trumped by total confinement, which drew more on these narratives of controlling black dangerousness than previous notions of correcting and rehabilitating white manhood. In this era, the prison system implemented actuarial or risk-based techniques for governing prison populations that supplanted individualizing, subjective, gendered techniques for assessment and classification. No longer was gender deviance a problem to be identified and isolated or researched. Now, individual distinctions needed to be minimized in order to maintain prison order. In this era, we saw a loosening in the precision of gender classification to facilitate population-level warehousing of working-class people of color. Small adjustments notwithstanding, the CDC's 1985 manual closely resembled the 1977 text. Prisoners classified as B category were identified as medical types, e.g., post-operative transsexuals, with clear patterns of behavior, a pattern of transvestism or prostitution, quote, active homosexual involvement, or, quote, recurrent homosexual behavior. But the 1990 manual illustrated a changing tide, introducing more ambiguity into B category and replacing medical and psychiatric expertise with discretion for prison administrators. Whereas sociological and psychiatric screening was built into the classification process in earlier periods, the 1990 manual explicitly stated that medical classification in the form of a 128C form was not needed for inclusion in this category. The manual noted that the category applied to, quote, preoperative transsexuals or active homosexuals whose appearance and personality make them incompatible with general population. This language empowered prison staff to make their own determinations about the effect that a given prisoner's appearance and personality would have within the prison. The 1990 classification manual also created a loophole out of the entire category on administrative grounds, noting that inmates shall not be placed in Category B solely on the basis of sexual preference or feminine traits, nor remain in Category B longer than their appearance and conduct, quote, makes necessary. In this period, the prison was concerned with managing populations, and to do so, sought to standardize and de-individualize prisoners. Therefore, classification of gender variance became more fluid, and trans feminine prisoners were sent to prisons across the state based on their risk level. In response to political pressure from feminist advocates, prison systems in the early 2000s began to assimilate language of gender differences and craft gender-specific policies. Prison administrators engaged in what Emily Hobson has called gender paternalism, presenting themselves as the defender of feminized victims. The 2000 classification included the statement that B category is, quote, intended to provide safe, supportive housing for those likely to be easy victims of sexual assault, as well as to avoid the conflict and disruption their presence would create in a general population institution. In November of 2012, formalized in the 2013 classification manual, CDC formally replaced the label for effeminate homosexuals with the new designation, transgendered inmates. For the first time, this category applied to gender variance in men and women's prisons. The new category required a medical diagnosis and entitled those so classified to bras or boxer shorts. The classification also stated that prisoners designated as, quote, transgendered inmates should be housed within a subset of prisons to, quote, ensure inmate patients receive the necessary medical care and mental health treatment. Gender classification within prisons is changing, but rather than celebrating this as an unqualified progressive victory, it's worth considering where we've been. How can we think about the current policies of trans rights within an apparatus of racialized captivity and death? How does this moment assume a homogeneous gender identity, or that gender is the primary mode of existence for trans people of color in prison? What would it look like to approach or challenge prison gender classification through the concepts of a coalitional politics, as gestured to by Kathy Cohen, or the forced queering Sarah Haley demonstrates in histories of carceral control of Black women? The history of gender classification in the California prison system from the 1940s to 2018 puts our current moment into context. This history demonstrates the prison's ability to institutionalize new legal gender rules while simultaneously maintaining and expanding its capacity to imprison working-class people and people of color. We are accustomed to thinking about prisons as total institutions that maintain a fixed gender binary. But this history shows that prison gender classification is actually flexible in the service of maintaining the, quote, legitimacy and administrative order of the carceral system as a whole. Understanding that the flexibility of prison gender classification is a technique for maintaining carceral domination can help us think more critically about our current moment. Because gender classification is tied to prison legitimacy, it can be changed with political pressure, but these changes can be co-opted to justify a system that is fundamentally violent. Although I don't have time to talk about my oral history data in detail, I want to share 3 brief comments based on the stories of formerly incarcerated trans women shared with me about their experiences in the California prison system from the 1970s to 2018. So first, although trans women have won access to resources through institutional categories like B category, they have also opted out of that category. In fact, Rachel, one of the 3 women who fought to win Bras and Hormones in 1977, declassified herself as B category the following year because she wanted to access educational opportunities and programming denied to people at the facility designated for B category prisoners. Gender classification determined housing placement, so other trans women opted out of B category because they wanted to pursue romantic relationships, or because they felt safer within their broader racial community than in a unit segregated by gender. Trans women have fought to change gender classification policies to gain access to resources distributed by gender, but they have also changed their own gender classification to access those resources. These women were all clear about their female identity. They also understood that prison gender classification was a technology of coercion and resource control, not a source of recognition they required in order to be real. So what conclusions does this data offer? I think there are 4. So first, legal prison gender regimes are flexible. Understanding that different techniques of gender classification can maintain carceral power, we can be more critical of the notion that new transgender prison policies inherently weakens the carceral state. Second, gender classification is a technique for reproducing the racial violence and dispossession of the prison system, and gender definitions institutionalized by the prison are themselves racialized. Third, administrative gender regimes organize prisoners' lives in meaningful ways. So prisoner solidarity, which I define as joining people in their fights for survival and liberation, will likely mean we have to figure out some ways to challenge these administrative systems. And yet, and this is point 4, in considering what kinds of reforms might assist with everyday survival, we must recognize that identity isn't identification. We shouldn't assume that people who identify as trans would make the same choices in navigating a coercive bureaucracy organized by gender. Even if we all agree on our goals, like dismantling, changing, and building a beautiful future, there are still many tactical questions about what to do next. But to think about charting our course, I think we can learn from the past. Thank you.
All right. I'll just offer a few comments and then see if I can ask you some questions. Thank you so much, Joss. That was a great presentation. I'm sure that we will want to hear about the methods, given the last panel. No doubt we'll come back to your oral histories, because actually methods are not incidental here, because, of course, doing research in prisons is no joke, right? I mean, even getting access to a safe space within which people can actually talk and can talk in open ways is part of the struggle. So that would be the first topic that I think would be worth talking about. Your work, though, it actually really resonates with Riley's book in the sense that one of the points that Riley makes in Black on Both Sides is that one of the traits that we consider to be a liberatory feature of transgender politics now, i.e. the sudden, startling flexibility of gender norms that we're experiencing, that we see across an array of popular cultural formats, is in fact not necessarily the sign of progress, but a feature of the installation of racial systems within and foundational to what we call gender in the first place. So Riley gives us this classification of fungibility, the fungibility of the slave body, that meant one body could be substituted for another, and in fact, all slave bodies were sort of material, if you like, for medical research to produce the truth of gender. That back history, or that foundational history that Riley gives us, then makes sense of some of the material in your work. So it seems to me that that might be an important reference point. Second point that I would want to make here is that we should all pay attention to these homosocial environments in which the question of transgender becomes so pressing. It isn't an accident that Trump is, for example, speaking about the military. That's another place where we see the homosocial division according to a gender system that we're all very aware has expired, right? Why do we have women's forces and men's forces? And doesn't that, in fact, produce the very problem that is now seen as the thing that must be excluded for the military to be strong? But that problem was produced by the production of a homosocial institution in the first place. So similarly with prisons, you can't kind of fix the problem that the prison is a part of the production of. There's no fix in the prison. So in relationship to one of Joss's points, Joss suggested that we have to approach some of the questions that his research produces very carefully, because it's not clear which strategies will intensify the hold that the carceral system has on racial communities and which strategies would potentially end to the abolition of the system. I think it becomes clear that any project about the prison that isn't, first of all, an abolitionist project can only intensify that carceral hold. So I'd love us to think about what it would mean to address this question in relationship to an abolitionist project in which we only think about where bodies should go by understanding that bodies should not be going anywhere. They should not be in cages in the first place. So how can we take that abolitionist insight to some of the issues that you raise? Another point that occurs to me is the question of the punk is super interesting, and Tavia Nyong'o's written about punk and the way in which the punk is at root a prison term for the effeminate, often racialized male body who is used sexually by other prisoners, and that Tavia suggests this tells a very different history of punk than the one that we've received from folks like Dick Hebdige. So I wonder, if we could think about then these very different understandings and classifications of gender and sexuality that exist in prisons, and then what impact they have outside of prisons. I mean, your project necessarily is focused on the prison, but what happens outside of the prison to some of these terminologies and some of these relationships that develop within? A better way to answer that question, it seems to me, is through women's prisons. And that's obviously not your project, and it's not your project for reasons that you've laid out for us, that there was a sort of focus on effeminate male inmates, the problems they, quote unquote, created in men's prisons, and there is less of a worry about the women's prison. But the women's prison, it seems to me, is a place where we see another kind of production of a very different gender system, because women in prison have created these prison families in which someone is the father and someone is the mother, and those are gendered roles. And sometimes those roles carry on outside of the prison and sometimes they don't. But in a film that, in The Aggressives, a film that, for example, Kara Keeling has written about that Riley referred to earlier, there's a fascinating moment in that film where one of the butchers in the film has been in prison and is explaining a whole sexual system that adheres to the women's prison that is quite different outside of the prison. So I wonder if we could, what do we want to say about the women's prison here and the production of gendered norms, gendered classifications, particularly given that women are not generally placed in the category of sex criminal, for example. So can you infer from the research you've done on men's prisons how this may or may not be applied to women's prisons? So those are some ideas that I have.
Great. All right, so I want to respond to all of those very generative questions, and maybe we'll try to do so briefly. But sure, methods are super important. So I think I should say first that as someone that first, before coming to graduate school, did have and still do have personal relationships with trans people in prison, it felt really important to me coming into this project that I was interviewing people in prison, and ultimately came to decide that due to the kinds of surveillance on people in prison, there wasn't a way for me to actually satisfy the IRB, which felt as though I needed to have the California Department of Corrections authorization and sort of access to my material. I didn't feel like I was able to interview people in prison satisfying IRB rules and my own ethical, political, personal concerns for the well-being of people in prison. And so my ultimate decision, which was to do 13 months of ethnography with trans prisoner advocacy organizations, which meant understanding the kinds of things people were doing between the summer of 2017 and summer of 2018 to support people currently inside, but to rely on oral history interviews with formerly incarcerated trans people to gather the bulk of my accounts of everyday life inside. And even though I originally thought of interviewing formerly incarcerated people as a sort of ethical, practical way of talking to people that had lived experience but were under a less carceral surveillance, that actually was exactly what led me to these beautiful stories of women in their 60s and 70s who had been in prison in the 70s and 80s. And so what had started actually as kind of a reaction to the limitations of being able to talk to currently incarcerated people, I actually found that created this new kind of connection to people and their stories that I wouldn't otherwise have maybe been able to hear and learn from.
Did you talk to currently incarcerated, or did you only talk to formerly incarcerated people?
No. As part of my ethnographic work, I was reading letters that people were sending to advocacy organizations. I was talking to advocates about their lawsuits. When they went into prison and were talking to people, they were telling me what was happening. So secondhand, I think I understood a lot of what was happening, but I myself was not talking to currently incarcerated people for this project. Yeah, in terms of Riley's work, I've been hugely inspired by his writing. And I think this question of the racialization that is inherent to the production of gender norms and kind of the outsides, and to think about that not just in terms of transness, but like I think we would see in Miriam Kaba's work or Sarah Haley's work the way that Black women are produced as kind of a queer gender category, or maybe Sarah Haley's argued we should think about the Black woman as existing in a different kind of gender category, that actually we have to think about race within gender classification at the primary ontological level. Yeah, I think analytically, that feels very important to me. And then the project of sort of tracing administratively how gender categories make use of different kinds of racialized gender knowledge is empirically, I think, where I go from those questions. In terms of homosocial spaces, this is also, I think it actually connects to this question of how knowledge, identities, people move from the prison and into the world. So I would just say also within sociology, there's been a lot of panic about prisons as homosocial spaces, and incredibly detailed literature about prisons producing queerness. And Regina Kunzel talks about this in her book, Criminal Intimacies, about how the modern sexual category of sexual identity as being something that is fixed, like one is a homosexual or is a heterosexual, is really destabilized by spaces like the prison or the boarding school or any of these spaces where people are engaging, you know, the women's college, where people are producing sexual selves and sexual worlds that are at odds with the modern sexual categories as though they are fixed. And so I think that it's that way that I've been thinking about homosocial spaces. When I've talked to formerly incarcerated people about their lives inside, oftentimes people did talk about their romantic or sexual relationships, some of which were beautiful and meaningful and some of which were painful. But I haven't yet been writing about those, I think in part because within sociology it does feel perilous to participate in a discourse that's been so structured by these concerns that are really, I think, rooted in heterosexism and also the racism associated with the prison as a kind of atavistic, backwards space prior to modern sexual identity categories. And maybe I'll just briefly touch on abolition and women's prisons. Yeah, so I am absolutely an abolitionist and have been an abolitionist before I was a sociologist. And so a lot of my questions as a sociologist is how to produce empirical work that can be of service to people trying to break down and dismantle the prison system. And I think what I found is trying to trace very carefully the ways the prison system has changed over time, and to document the stories of people that have survived and fought for their lives and for their sisters in prison is the way that I've found I can be of best service to people understanding how the system reformats itself, and the things that maybe happened 40 years ago that we don't know, in part because archives don't always exist. And even just the anecdote I started with, the fact that trans women had fought and won bras and hormones in '77. None of the advocates that I spoke with in the Bay knew that history, and I just was blessed to meet this woman who was one of those three and told me her story and then could corroborate it with archival newspapers. So I think that there is something about getting to document those stories that is part of our abolitionist work. And for women's prisons, I do have some ethnographic information about that. It hasn't been the focus of this project because the prison administratively has been less focused with categorizing gender in women's prisons, but I would say that the administrator's concern with same-sex sexuality and gender variance has been very racialized. So specifically the idea that Black women were going to kind of convert white women to same-sex sexuality. And so there is a similar way that race has been part of the administrative formation of gender nonconformity and concerns with managing same-sex sex in women's prisons.
All right, so why don't we take a round of questions for Joss? Christina? Two Christinas. Christina Heatherton.
Well, I'm Christina too. Yes, I think the pinnacle of my academic career was when I accidentally got Christina 1's mail, fan mail. Anyway, thank you so much for this extraordinary research. This is so exciting. I was burning up a whole pen taking notes. I can't wait to read the dissertation. So I just had a question about something I wanted to understand a little bit better. You mentioned this relationship between the coterminous rise of feminist attention to rape in the period, while at the same time you're noting the racial coding of sexual violence as Black aggression against white vulnerability in the CDC and the California prisons that you're studying. So I'm just wondering if you could reflect and talk a little bit more about the kind of feminist organizing around rape, particularly when considering campaigns by feminist and third world organizers who were thinking about rape in the prison. So I'm thinking particularly of Emily Thuma's research on the Joanne Little case, where Black woman killed the prison guard who assaulted her. And, so I'm just curious to hear a little bit more about how you're thinking about that relationship.
Sure, thank
you. Thanks so much for that fabulous paper. I have just a very precise methodological follow-up question, which is how the people that you interviewed and or communicated with through letters, how they found their way to a relationship with the organization with which you worked and that they were associated. And so what I'm mostly interested in is if there's both how this organization develops relationship with incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people, and if there are some features then of the group of people that you interviewed that are collective based on their relationship to the organization, whether it's demographic, whether it's about the terms of their incarceration, whether anything else. And then I also want to second the question about around Emily Thuma's work as well.
Thank you. So, is there another
You're
question?
taking twos or threes? Twos.
Is there one more?
I have one.
Great. Kendall.
It's just a question really about triangulation, and it's a method question. So I've been working, as I mentioned yesterday, on this introduction to an issue of critical analysis of law on queer legal theory. And there's a moment in the colloquy that Paisley Curra and A.L. Gross are having with Joe Fischel, in which Paisley wants to press really hard on this idea of disaggregating queer and trans, right? I want to put that idea, on which I'm taking no position, in conversation with the notion of, I think I'm quoting you, the racialization that is interior to the production of gender norms, right? And to the extent that being able to make knowledge claims about practices of racialization that are interior to gender norms in the context of these prison systems, is it your position from a methodological perspective that we need to disaggregate a critical race theory analysis from a trans critical analysis? What precisely is the relationship between those two methods if one subscribes to the proposition that racialization is interior to gender norms?
You have a question as well?
Sure, go ahead.
Hello? Yeah. I have two questions about regulation. I'm curious about the situation in California. We have been conducting an inquiry as well in Brazil related to this issue. First is, what's the current regulation of trans men inmates in California? Are they sent to women's or men's facilities? And regarding the women, trans women inmates, I understood that the solution that has been provided so far is an aisle in a men's facilities. My question is, are there any experience of sending trans women inmates to women's facilities? And what do you think? What's your opinion about it?
All right. Thank you for all of those questions. All right. So the first question, I think, is how can we understand social movements in relationship to prison assimilation of what appears to be that language? And so I think regularly about Joanne Little and organizing around her situation. I think there's a lot that we could learn today for anti-violence organizers that are trying to have an anti-carceral and anti-racist anti-gender violence approach. And I think that what feels so pernicious to me is the way that language of social movements can be co-opted and used by a prison system that, of course, can provide none of the alternatives that I think organizers that were fighting for Joanne Little would have wanted. So thinking about that as a time period when a lot of feminist organizations were thinking about collective defense and actively fighting against prisons and policing, and yet had different kinds of their critique mobilized by a prison system that, of course, was not providing any of those solutions. And I think that's actually paralleled by what happened in the late 1990s, early 2000s with gender-responsive language. So what I found, again, feminist organizers that were saying there are specific kinds of gendered violence occurring in prison, and we need to pay attention to that. The prison then mobilizes that critique to say, yes, of course, we will provide you with feminized prisons, which is not at all, I think, what the radical edge of feminist movements were arguing for, but which was persuasive, I think, to some people that didn't have that kind of critique of the state as essentially operating in violent ways in the prison. So I think it is what I would suggest is that we have to be very attentive to the difference between the material realities envisioned by movements and by prisons that might use language from movements. In terms of the question of methods and how I met people, Yes, so that's also a great question. And I had previously done research looking at trans reentry, and what I did in terms of recruiting people for interviews was kind of a combined approach. So I did meet people through the organization, but I also posted flyers around. I paid some women who handed out flyers at the Trans March. I tried to be able to reach people that were connected to organizations, but also for whatever reason were not connected to organizations, and I thought that was useful. I do think that in general, the people that I met I'm sure were more precarious than people that I didn't talk to. You know, so for instance, I would say that more of the people that I interviewed had spent more time in prison as opposed to having spent one time in prison. And I think that is probably the typical but not complete picture of trans incarceration. I interviewed more trans people of color, which is, you know, statistically representative, but you know, there could be important things to be learned by looking at middle-class white trans men who went to prison, for instance. And I didn't document those stories in the same way, and so I think that might be something that I can't speak to. In terms of the separation of trans and queer and how to think about racialization as a part of that, you know, I think that what that makes me think about is the administrative elision of that difference and at what point that is administratively separate. So for instance, as I show in the 40s through really, I would say 2013, the California prison system thinks about gender and sexuality as fundamentally connected. And I would argue even today it's seen as fundamentally connected in large part because of the kinds of fears or notions around sexual violence so associated with the idea of transferring trans women to women's prisons. So even if legally trans prisoners are now a category defined by gender, obviously sexual regulation is part of the cultural and I would say administrative discourse around trans prisoners. And so I think for me, thinking about racialization as being at the core of gender and sexuality, gender and sexuality are more linked than dissimilar for much of the administrative history that I'm looking at, and I'm trying to kind of track it administratively. And in terms of this super important, just empirical question about what is the current California policy for trans men and trans women. So the California prison policy is to categorize people based on genitalia. I would say, however, you know, and of course the beautiful thing about talking to real people is that you learn about how their lives are not determined by the rules. So for instance, a lot of mainstream news would tell you that Shiloh Quine, who was a trans woman, moved to a women's prison in 2017. So the first trans woman to be transferred to a women's prison. And as soon as I started talking to trans people, they were like, oh no, you know, of course, you know, she was there in the 80s, and yeah, no, she was there in the 70s. And, you know, actually there are a couple of trans women who were actively involved in women's prison organizing in the 90s, really integrated into advocacy around healthcare and women's healthcare in prison. And so I think this is what's really useful about understanding the policy and then the histories. Yeah, but I would say that what I've seen, and I think, you know, again to this question of how can we try to be tactical administratively about trying to make shifts to the system without rebuilding it, I think if there was to be a change to trans prisoner policy, the thing that I've seen as potentially offering the most space are any policy that allow people to make their own choices about where they would be housed. So I know Connecticut passed a law that said that trans people would be housed by their gender identity. A lot of the women that I spoke with, as I alluded to, made intentional choices to declassify themselves. I think that there's something that Dr. Storton and Clune Taylor have alluded to in terms of the usefulness of opacity, especially when dealing with systems of structural violence, that would lead me to say that anything that links identity to these kinds of resources is not going to serve some people that identify as trans. PREA actually does, which is the Prison Rape Elimination Act, does say that trans and queer people should be able to make housing determinations based on safety concerns, but in California that's not policy.
Yes, Riley.
Also, I've been continuing to learn so much in Q&A. Okay, yes. So there's a lingering question for me, I was actually thinking a lot about Siobhan Somerville and the homosocial, and I was thinking there was a way that you were talking through the history that suggested that the way that they managed gender nonconforming prisoners was initially or earlier modeled on understandings of Mexican masculinity, and then later modeled on kind of representations or understandings of black masculinity. And I was very curious to hear about, I mean, the kind of hardest question, which is why, but like to move, but to rather than to like let that be kind of like a natural shift, I'm very curious about these kinds of strategies of managing population that are based on different forms of racial management in and outside of the prison.
Maybe I can, is there another question or I could speak directly to? Great, okay. I think this is so important. I think this question is really important. And I haven't figured out, I think, that key question of why yet, but am trying to figure out how changing both racial demographics, but also the kinds of fictions, imaginaries about prison are shaping this. And this was not something that I expected to find, but actually it wasn't until I was looking at these records of kind of the 1945 to 49 records that I was able to see that actually when there is this racialized fear of the rapist in prison, at that time it is Mexican men. And I think this also becomes a point when it's really important when we're thinking about prison, race, gender, and violence to think about what is going to be the same maybe across the United States and what is going to be different depending on how power operates in different state and local contexts. And it makes me think about the important work that's been done to track how the criminalization of indigenous or native people and the racialization of indigenous people has been a part of carceral control, especially if you're looking at somewhere like North Dakota. Whereas I think the racialization of Mexican men and black men was more what I was seeing in the California context. So I appreciate that question and I hope to develop it further, but yeah. 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 Thank you. Sure. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sure. Sure. Sure.
And I think, Kendall, that question that Paisley raises about whether we should disaggregate queer and trans, I mean, I think the work that we've heard presented today shows, like, why? Why would you, I mean, and Joss, you're sort of responding by saying, well, queer studies is sort of the investigation of sexuality, and trans studies is looking at the production of gender nonconformity. But what we see in the context of the prison is that's a permeable boundary in the sense that, particularly in the men's prison, gender nonconformity is associated with the Queen's Row, with the presentation of male effeminacy in the context of sexual relations. And I was trying to say that something similar goes on in the women's prison. And so that's like an academic question to me that doesn't necessarily have much value when you're looking at populations who are simultaneously produced by regimes, administrative regimes of sexuality and gender as they are racialized. Yeah. Kendall, did you? Yeah. We're sort of out of time. Yeah.
Because Che wasn't able to join us, is a conversation that we will postpone and defer to a future whose urgency I think is clear to us now. There's a lot of research to be done. And there are a lot of transversal conversations that need to take place in a future across this work that we've been discussing over the course of the last 2.5 years, which takes as its object of investigation the relationship or relationships between and among genders and violence. But again, I just want, in closing, to register our collective debt of gratitude to the Center for the Study of Social Difference and this project which it birthed on reframing gender violence, because I don't think anyone's going to leave this room unpersuaded of the critical importance of continuing this work. And the fertilization of this work and the formulation of the question and the creation of a platform or context for investigation and discussion that the Center for the Study of Social Difference has so generously provided us, I think is going to bear fruit for decades to come. And it's fitting, actually, that we ended the conference with work that's part of a dissertation project. I know I, for one, am super excited to see this next wave of work, which is configuring and reconfiguring concepts and categories, methods, contaminating disciplinary boundaries in ways that we are coming to realize are absolutely necessary as an intellectual matter, in the same way that they've come to be recognized. This work, this kind of practice has come to be recognized as absolutely necessary with respect to social and political movements. And that, I think, is in the best spirit of the vision of the Center for the Study of Social Difference. So thank you again to all the folks who helped make this happen. Thank you to our participants. We're going to adjourn for a reception, but not before thanking Joss and thanking Jack for a wonderful session.
And thank you to Kendall for convening this event.